Hello and welcome back. Get comfortable, settle in, and let your mind drift as we journey together through one of the most pivotal moments in the Fallout universe. Tonight, we're exploring the day that changed everything for Boston, Massachusetts. The day the Commonwealth fell silent. This isn't a story of heroes or villains. This is a story about a city, its people, and the 2 hours that transformed both into something unrecognizable. Close your eyes if you'd like, and picture a city you might almost recognize. A Boston that could have been in a world that diverged from our own sometime after the Second World War. Picture skyscrapers reaching toward an autumn sky, their chrome and glass surfaces reflecting the morning sun. Picture elevated highways threading through the urban landscape like silver ribbons. Picture families sitting down to breakfast, workers catching the monorail downtown, students hurrying to classes at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. Picture a world on the edge of tomorrow, gleaming with nuclear-powered promise and retro-futuristic optimism. And then picture it all ending in fire. But before we get to that moment, that terrible Saturday morning in October, we need to understand what Boston had become by the year 2077. We need to walk its streets, meet its people, and understand what was lost, because only then can we truly comprehend the magnitude of what happened when the bombs fell and the Commonwealth was born from the ashes of Massachusetts. Boston in 2077 was a city of contradictions, a place where colonial history and atomic age futurism existed in an uneasy marriage. The old brick and cobblestone of America's revolutionary past remained, carefully preserved as tourist attractions along the Freedom Trail. You could still visit the old State House in Scollay Square, the oldest public building in Boston, where the Massachusetts colonial government once met. You could walk through Faneuil Hall, that colonial-era merchant hall that had witnessed so many protests during the Revolutionary War. You could stand before the Old North Church and imagine Paul Revere's Midnight Ride beginning from its shadow. But rising behind these carefully maintained relics of the past, the city of tomorrow had taken root. The financial district had transformed into something that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. Skyscrapers of glass and steel pierced the sky, their surfaces gleaming with an almost otherworldly sheen. These weren't the buildings of our timeline. These were monuments to an alternate path of technological development, one where the miniaturized electronics revolution never happened, where vacuum tubes and atomic energy drove progress into strange and wondrous directions. The mass fusion building dominated the skyline, a towering testament to the company that powered the entire Commonwealth. Founded in 2043 by Carl Oslo, a visionary engineer who had grown frustrated with traditional methods during his time at Poseidon Energy, mass fusion had revolutionized energy distribution. Or so they claimed. Their Clean Power initiative promised affordable, safe nuclear power for every home in Massachusetts. By 2070, they had achieved near-total dominance of the state's energy market. The building itself was impossible to miss. Tall, imposing, with the mass fusion logo visible from miles away, it stood as a symbol of corporate power and technological achievement. Inside, hundreds of employees worked to keep the Commonwealth powered. They developed fusion cores, fusion engines, and the compact fusion reactors that powered everything from cars to household appliances. The building's own reactor, deep in its basement levels, hummed with contained atomic fire, a testament to the company's mastery over the atom. But mass fusion had secrets. The Clean Power initiative wasn't quite as clean as advertised. Company documents, had anyone bothered to look closely, would have revealed a disturbing pattern of environmental contamination. Lake Quannapowitt, once a popular fishing and swimming spot, had become dangerously toxic. Radiation levels exceeded safe limits by 1,500% year over year. Mass fusion's containment facilities were dumping waste directly into the lake through pipelines. The company knew. They denied everything. When people started getting sick, experiencing nausea, vomiting, hair loss, and radiation burns, Mass Fusion maintained that their products were perfectly safe. This was the price of progress in 2077. Corporate power had grown so immense, so intertwined with government infrastructure, that trying to determine where one ended and the other began was a largely academic exercise. Across the Charles River in Cambridge sat another monument to human ambition, the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. Known as CIT to locals, this prestigious university had shaped the technological landscape of not just Boston, but the entire nation. Its alumni included Robert House, the brilliant mind who had founded Robco Industries in 2042 after graduating from CIT, turning it into one of the most profitable companies on the planet within just 5 years. The CIT campus sprawled across Cambridge, a mix of classical architecture and cutting-edge research facilities. Here, the brightest minds worked on projects that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. Robotics research advanced at a rapid pace. Materials science promised new polymers and compounds with revolutionary applications. The Institute's experimental nuclear reactor, buried deep beneath the campus, provided power for countless experiments. Students hurried between classes, dreaming of being the next great inventor, the next visionary who would change the world. They had no idea how much their world was about to change. The city's infrastructure reflected the technological optimism of the age. A sophisticated network of elevated superhighways cut through the urban landscape, allowing traffic to flow above the crowded streets below. These weren't simple concrete overpasses. These were engineering marvels, multi-level structures that seemed to defy gravity as they threaded between and around buildings. Monorail lines hummed along their tracks, whisking passengers from the suburbs into downtown Boston in minutes. The Red Line of the MTA provided metro service through tunnels beneath the city, including College Square Station, that connected Cambridge to the rest of the transit network. From certain vantage points, the city looked like something from a pulp science fiction magazine. Chrome and glass towers rose toward the sky. Elevated highways created a complex three-dimensional traffic system. Vertibirds, those experimental vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, occasionally buzzed overhead on government or corporate business. The future had arrived, and it gleamed. But beneath the gleaming surface, cracks had begun to show. The resource wars had been grinding on for decades by 2077. It had started back in 2052 when the European Commonwealth dissolved into quarreling nation-states bent on controlling the last remaining fossil fuel reserves. The world had grown desperate as petroleum supplies dwindled. Nuclear power could provide electricity, but the transportation sector still relied heavily on petroleum-based fuels. The economic consequences rippled across every nation. In 2066, China made its move. Chinese forces invaded Alaska, seeking control of the oil pipeline at Anchorage. It was a calculated gamble born of desperation. China needed those reserves to survive. The United States responded with overwhelming force, deploying their new power armor technology to the Alaskan front. For over a decade, the two superpowers ground against each other in a conflict that consumed resources and lives at an alarming rate. The United States, never content to fight defensively, annexed Canada in the process. The official explanation was to secure Canadian support and facilitate supply lines to Alaska. The reality was far less noble. Canada's resources were needed, and the increasingly authoritarian American government had no qualms about taking them. Canadian resistance fighters battled American forces in a conflict that only ended when the Great War made such distinctions meaningless. By early 2077, the tide had turned. American forces, bolstered by winterized T-51 power armor units, finally liberated Anchorage. The operation, commanded by General Constantine Chase, became a propaganda victory for the United States. Commemorative memorials were erected. The media celebrated the triumph. But the war was far from over. American troops pushed into mainland China, engaging in brutal combat across the Chinese front. For the citizens of Boston, the war had become a constant background noise to daily life. They had lived with it for so long that it seemed almost normal. But by 2077, the strain was showing everywhere you looked. Massachusetts Lieutenant Governor Graham had placed Boston under martial law. A strict curfew was enforced. Military checkpoints appeared throughout the city. Soldiers in power armor patrolled the streets, their heavy footfalls echoing off building facades. It was supposed to make people feel safe. Instead, it made them feel occupied. The food situation had deteriorated drastically. Rationing sites appeared across Boston, including the Boston Police Rationing Site. Lines formed early each morning as people waited for their allotted supplies. The rationing system was supposed to be orderly, fair, controlled. It was anything but. Corruption was rampant. Those with connections got more. Those without went hungry. The Roxbury Food Bank became a flashpoint. In October 2077, just weeks before the end, an unknown person smashed the glass of the food bank. Perhaps it was frustration. Perhaps it was hunger-driven desperation. Perhaps it was a deliberate provocation. Whatever the cause, the soldiers stationed there opened fire on the civilians. 4 confirmed dead, 8 injured. The incident became known as the Roxbury Food Riot, but it was hardly an isolated case. Food riots spread across the city. Denver experienced similar unrest. So did other major urban centers. The social fabric was unraveling. People were scared, hungry, and increasingly convinced that their government had abandoned them for corporate interests and foreign wars. Other problems plagued the city. The infrastructure that had seemed so impressive was beginning to fail. The Western water treatment plant, for instance, suffered catastrophic equipment failures. The facility was forced to compensate with experimental wastewater recycling procedures. In 2077, this led to a cholera outbreak. Rather than admit the problem, the facility staff and regional municipal utility services colluded with other plants to swap tainted water for clean water in what they called the Western Wellness Press Initiative. The cover-up was complete, people died, and no one in power seemed to care. The sewage system, parts of which dated back 200 years, had never been properly modernized or reinforced. Combined sewer and rainwater would occasionally overflow, flooding streets with contaminated water. It was a health crisis waiting to happen. One problem among many that the city simply couldn't address because all resources were directed toward the war effort. Poseidon Energy, one of the largest power companies on the East Coast, had been trying to buy out mass fusion right before the war. Corporate warfare mirrored the military conflict happening across the Pacific. Everyone was scrambling for position, trying to ensure they would come out on top when the dust settled. They never considered that there might not be an after. They never truly believed that the worst could happen. Despite everything, life continued. People adapted. They had to. Bostonians went to work, came home, watched the news on their television sets, listened to the radio. The Boston Bugle newspaper still published daily. The Swatting Sultans, Boston's baseball team, were vying for the World Series championship. They had won in 1903, 1912, 1915, 1916 and 1918, and fans hoped 2077 would see them victorious once again. In the suburbs, families lived in modest homes that seemed plucked from a 1950s dream, albeit one powered by nuclear energy. In places like Sanctuary Hills, just north of Concord, life had a strange veneer of normalcy. Sure, the news was troubling. Yes, there were food shortages and martial law in the city. But here, in these quiet neighborhoods, you could almost pretend everything was fine. The neighborhood had that quintessential American suburban feel, ranch-style homes with carports for the nuclear-powered automobiles that hummed quietly rather than roaring like their petroleum-burning predecessors. Small front yards with struggling grass, Mr. Handy robots occasionally trundling by on their shopping errands or household duties, children playing in the street, their laughter echoing in the autumn air. Voltec had been doing a brisk business in this area. Their sales representatives had been making the rounds for years, selling the ultimate insurance policy, a guaranteed spot in one of their state-of-the-art underground vaults in case of nuclear war. Vault 111, they said, would protect its residents from any threat. It was the future of survival. Most people didn't take it seriously. The vault seemed like an overreaction, a waste of money. Nuclear war was a threat, yes, but surely governments would never be insane enough to actually use those weapons. Mutual assured destruction was supposed to prevent exactly that scenario. The acronym MAD was apt. It would be madness to start a nuclear war. No one would win. And yet, despite the reassurances, despite the faith in human rationality, the tension kept building. Those who paid attention to the news saw disturbing signs. Reports of Chinese submarines off the west coast, high-altitude bombers near the Bering Strait, increasing DEFCON levels. The pieces were moving into position. Saturday morning, October 23rd, 2077. It started as a morning like any other. The sun rose over Boston Harbor, casting golden light across the water and the city beyond. In Sanctuary Hills, people stirred in their beds, alarm clocks chiming with their characteristic nuclear-age tones. Mr. Handy units throughout the neighborhood activated their morning protocols, preparing breakfast for their families. In one particular home in Sanctuary Hills, a family was just beginning their day. A veteran, recently returned from the war, was preparing for a speech at a local veterans event. His spouse was tending to their infant son. The normalcy of the morning routine was comforting. Make breakfast, feed the baby, get dressed, handle the little emergencies that make up domestic life. The doorbell rang. A Vault Tech representative stood on the doorstep, clipboard in hand, with that practiced smile of a salesperson who has given the same pitch 1,000 times. He was there to confirm their reservation for Vault 111. Just a formality, he said. A few signatures. Everything was in order. They were on the list. If anything happened, they would be safe. The conversation was brief. The representative left. Life continued. In downtown Boston, the morning rush was underway. Workers filed into office buildings. The Mass Fusion building received its employees through its grand lobby, security checking badges with practiced efficiency. At CIT, early morning classes were beginning. Professors lectured, students took notes, research continued in dozens of laboratories. At the Boston Police rationing site, lines had already formed. People waited patiently, resignedly, for their allotted supplies. Soldiers stood guard, their hands never far from their weapons after the Roxbury incident. The tension was palpable, but people endured it. What choice did they have? At Fenway Park, preparations were underway for an upcoming game. The swatting Sultans were practicing, their star pitcher, Matt Murtaugh, throwing practice pitches. The team hoped to defeat Texas and deliver Boston's first World Series victory since 1918. Sports provided an escape from the grimness of daily life, something normal to hold on to. In the offices of the Boston Bugle, reporters and editors worked on stories for the afternoon edition. They covered the ongoing food situation, the latest war news, local politics, routine stories for what seemed like another routine day. Throughout the Commonwealth, in towns like Concord, Lexington, and Salem, people went about their business. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Construction continued on various projects. The elevated highways hummed with traffic. The monorails glided along their tracks. But in command centers and defense installations, a very different morning was unfolding. At 12:03 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, in the darkest hour before dawn, the United States Pacific Fleet identified 3 unidentified submersible objects off the coast of California. Chinese submarines. They were moving into position. An alert went out, but it was classified. Top secret. The public wasn't informed. No need to cause panic. The reasoning went. It might be nothing. It might be a false alarm. At 3:37 a.m. Eastern, a squadron of high-altitude bombers was sighted off the Bering Strait. Another alert. Another classified report making its way through the military chain of command. Still no public announcement. People slept, unaware that the mechanisms of their destruction were being set in motion. 6 hours passed. In Boston, people woke up, had breakfast, started their day. At 9:13 a.m. Eastern, everything changed. The Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System detected the first 4 missile launches. The system, designed to give warning of nuclear attack, shrieked its electronic alarm through defense installations across the nation. Within seconds, analysts confirmed what the system was telling them. This was real. This was happening. 4 minutes later, NORAD confirmation sealed the world's fate. This was not a drill. This was not a false alarm. Nuclear weapons had been launched at the United States. The president, who had retreated to a secure location months earlier in anticipation of this exact scenario, gave the order at 9:26 a.m. Scenario MXCN91 retaliatory strike. If they were going to die, they would take their enemy with them. Mutual assured destruction wasn't a deterrent anymore. It was a promise being fulfilled. As American weapons launched from their silos and submarines, racing toward their targets across the Pacific and beyond, the first Chinese nuclear missiles reached their targets. Pennsylvania and New York were hit at 9:42 a.m. The bombs that had been falling through the atmosphere following ballistic trajectories calculated by computers struck with devastating force. 5 minutes later, at 9:47 a.m., the world effectively ended. Not all at once. The nuclear exchange would continue for 2 hours, but in those first 7 minutes between the first launches and the first impacts, everything humanity had built was set on the path to destruction. In Boston, the air raid sirens began to wail. The sound was like nothing else, a rising and falling wail that cut through the morning air, drowning out traffic noise, conversation, the normal sounds of urban life. Air raid sirens mounted on buildings and towers throughout the city, activated in sequence. The sound was designed to be heard, to be impossible to ignore. For many Bostonians, the first reaction was confusion. They had heard these sirens before during drills, monthly tests to ensure the civil defense system was working. Most people assumed this was just another drill, another test, an annoying interruption to their morning, but nothing serious. Some ignored the sirens entirely. They had jobs to get to, lives to live. How many false alarms had there been over the years? How many times had the government cried wolf about the threat of nuclear war? It had been going on for decades. Surely this was just more fear-mongering, more Cold War paranoia manifesting in unnecessary precautions. But others knew something in the quality of the sound, or perhaps in the reactions of others, told them this was different. Military personnel snapped to attention. Police officers grabbed their radios, demanding information. In command centers, organized chaos erupted as personnel scrambled to follow emergency protocols. At Voltec headquarters in Boston, a different alarm was sounding. The company's own detection systems had picked up the incoming threat. Voltec representatives throughout the region received emergency communications. Get to the vaults, initiate closure protocols. This was everything they had prepared for, everything they had sold to thousands of desperate people seeking safety from this exact scenario. In Sanctuary Hills, the Voltec representative who had been making his rounds that morning sprinted back toward Vault 111, his clipboard forgotten, his sales pitch abandoned in the face of reality. Behind him, families were emerging from their homes, confused, frightened, looking toward each other for answers that no one had. The veteran and his family heard the sirens. They saw their neighbors panicking. They saw a Voltec employee running past, shouting for people to get to the vault. And in that moment, the decision was simple. Grab the baby, run. Don't think about what you're leaving behind. Don't think about the home you've built, the possessions you've accumulated, the life you've lived. Just run. Throughout Boston, similar scenes played out. Some people ran for shelter. Others stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Some continued with their routines, either in denial or resignation. If the bombs were really coming, where could they go? What could they do? Better to face the end with dignity than die in a panicked stampede. At Fenway Park, the swatting sultans heard the sirens. The team, staff, and the few early arrivals in the stands made a collective decision. The stadium was reinforced concrete, built to last. The walls were thick. If they couldn't get to a proper shelter in time, the stadium itself might provide some protection. They moved inside, away from the open air, gathering in the interior spaces of the ancient ballpark. In downtown Boston, office workers poured into the streets, creating instant gridlock. Some tried to drive home, others ran for the nearest subway station, thinking the tunnels might protect them. The T stations filled with panicked crowds, people pushing and shoving to get underground, anywhere that might shield them from what was coming. At mass fusion, emergency protocols activated. The building's reactor went into emergency shutdown. Key personnel moved to reinforced interior spaces. Others evacuated, joining the streams of people fleeing through the financial district. At CIT, professors dismissed classes. Students scattered. Some ran for their dormitories. Others headed for the experimental nuclear reactor's underground levels, hoping the facility's shielding might protect them. A group of faculty and students made the decision to go deep, to take shelter in the lowest levels of the campus's underground spaces. It was a decision that would have profound consequences for the Commonwealth's future. In government buildings, officials scrambled to follow continuity of government protocols. Mayor Hildenbrand of Boston retreated to the Boston Mayoral Shelter, a bunker designed for exactly this scenario. Military commanders at bases throughout the region issued orders trying to maintain some semblance of order, even as everything collapsed around them. 3 minutes passed, 5, 10. The sirens continued their wailing song. People ran, people prayed, people waited, and then in the western sky they saw it. A flash of light, brilliant and terrible, bloomed on the horizon. For a fraction of a second, it was brighter than the sun. Those who looked directly at it were blinded. Those who didn't see it felt the light through closed eyelids, through walls, through everything. The flash was followed by a roiling cloud of fire and debris, rising into the sky in the characteristic mushroom shape that had haunted humanity's nightmares since 1945. The bomb had struck southwest of Boston. Ground zero was somewhere in what would later be called the Glowing Sea, in the area around Holliston. It was a high-yield weapon, far larger than the tactical nuclear devices that were standard in 2077. This was meant to destroy everything in a wide radius. The blast wave followed seconds later. Buildings shuddered, windows shattered. The ground itself seemed to shake as the pressure wave rolled across the landscape. In Sanctuary Hills, people watched in horror as the mushroom cloud rose in the distance. They had made it to Vault 111. The entrance platform was crowded with neighbors, all of them cleared for admission, all of them waiting for the elevator to take them down to safety. But the elevator took time, and they had to watch as their world ended. Another flash, this one closer. Cambridge, a smaller yield weapon but devastating nonetheless. An entire neighborhood leveled in an instant. The blast carved a crater into the earth, and the CIT campus, already ancient by 2077 standards, took heavy damage. Buildings collapsed. The reactor complex, fortunately, remained structurally sound despite the devastation above. At Vault 111, the platform finally began its descent. The last thing those people saw before the protective shell of the vault entrance closed over them was the fire consuming the horizon. The heat could be felt even at that distance. The sound was like the world breaking. They were the lucky ones. The nuclear exchange that would come to be known as the Great War lasted approximately 2 hours. In that time, thousands of nuclear weapons were launched, detonated, and forever altered the face of the planet. But let's focus on Boston, on the Commonwealth, on what happened in those 2 terrible hours. The Chinese submarine Yangtze 31, which had been lurking in Boston Harbor for days, launched its complement of nuclear missiles. All but one of the high-yield warheads successfully fired, arcing up into the atmosphere before descending toward their programmed targets. Captain Zhao, the submarine's commander, followed his orders with a heavy heart. He was a patriot, a military man, but he understood what he was doing. He was ending the world. The Yangtze's primary target appears to have been the Sentinel site in the Commonwealth, a nuclear missile depot and launch facility. It was a strategic target, the kind of installation that nuclear war planners would mark as high priority. Take out the enemy's ability to launch additional weapons. It made tactical sense. The missile aimed at the Sentinel site struck the ground southwest of Boston, creating the massive crater that would become the heart of the glowing sea. But there were other weapons, smaller yield devices, tactical nuclear warheads designed to destroy specific targets without the massive area devastation of strategic weapons. These fell throughout the Commonwealth. One struck Cambridge, creating the Cambridge crater. Others hit strategic locations around the region. Boston proper, despite being a major city, was never struck directly by a large nuclear weapon. This was either luck, strategy, or perhaps the result of interception attempts. The Sentinel site did have defensive capabilities. Perhaps some of the incoming weapons were destroyed or diverted. Perhaps Boston's status as a historical city made it a lower priority target compared to military installations. Whatever the reason, the city's core survived. But survival is a relative term. The blast waves from the explosion southwest of the city still caused tremendous damage. Buildings shuddered. Windows shattered across the entire metropolitan area. The elevated highways, those engineering marvels, took damage. Some sections collapsed immediately, others were weakened, destabilized, left hanging precariously in place where they would eventually fall over the coming decades. The electromagnetic pulses from the nuclear detonations played havoc with electronics. Communications went dead, power grids failed. The sophisticated network of computers and automation that had run so much of the city's infrastructure simply stopped working. In an instant, Boston was cut off from the outside world. The heat was incredible. Even miles from the blast sites, the thermal pulse from the explosions ignited fires. Wooden structures burst into flame. Vehicles caught fire. People caught outside suffered severe burns. The firestorm that followed the initial blasts consumed much of the city's outskirts. The fires would burn for days, feeding on the dried timber of residential areas, the petroleum products stored in warehouses, anything that could combust. In the harbor, ships capsized from the shock waves. The Yangtze itself was damaged, taking on water, its crew dying from radiation as the submarine's shielding failed. Captain Zhao would survive, transformed into a ghoul by the intense radiation exposure, but his crew was not so fortunate. Throughout the Commonwealth, anyone caught outside during the initial blasts faced terrible consequences. The flash of light from the explosions caused flash burns and permanent blindness. The blast waves crushed or threw people like rag dolls. The heat set clothing ablaze. Those who survived the initial effects still had to face the radiation that was already beginning to saturate the environment. Inside Fenway Park, the swatting sultans and the others who had taken shelter there felt the building shake. The reinforced walls that had been built to last through decades of New England weather held. The people inside were protected from the worst of the blast effects. They would survive, at least for a while, but they were trapped in a dying world. At the Boston mayoral shelter, Mayor Hildenbrand and his family cowered as the bunker shook. They were safe from the immediate effects, protected by thick concrete and earth. But an angry mob, people who had not been allowed into the shelter, people who were dying outside, began to assault the bunker. In the end, the mayor and his family would perish, though whether from the mob or from other causes remains unclear. In the underground levels of CIT, the faculty and students who had taken shelter felt the impacts through the earth itself. Dust fell from the ceiling. Emergency lights activated. They were alive, safe from the blasts, but they were cut off from the surface. The campus above them was in ruins. Everything they had known was gone. At military installations throughout the region, personnel attempted to maintain order and follow protocols. Emergency frequency RJ1138 went out over the airwaves, promising food, shelter, and aid at the South Boston military checkpoint. But the chaos was too great. Communications networks were disrupted. The chain of command had been broken by the electromagnetic pulses and by the simple fact that many command centers had been destroyed. At the Mass Bay Medical Center, military forces seized control, attempting to establish a triage point for the wounded, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Too many casualties, not enough supplies, not enough personnel. The medical center became a charnel house, a place where people went to die rather than be healed. The nuclear exchange lasted 2 hours. Around the world, thousands of nuclear weapons found their targets. China was destroyed. The United States was destroyed. The Soviet Union, which still existed in this alternate timeline, was destroyed. Europe, already fractured by its own resource wars, was consumed in nuclear fire. The Middle East, Africa, Asia, all were struck by nuclear weapons as the major powers emptied their arsenals in a final spasm of mutual destruction. At 11:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the last nuclear weapons detonated. The exchanges stopped, not because anyone chose to stop, but because there was nothing left to fire. The arsenals were empty, the cities were burning, the command centers were silent. The Great War was over. Humanity had lost. The immediate devastation was terrible enough, but what followed in the days after the bombs fell was perhaps even worse. About a week after the initial nuclear explosions, rain began to fall across the Commonwealth. People who had survived the blasts, who had found shelter and were cautiously emerging to survey the damage, looked up at the dark clouds gathering overhead and felt a moment of hope. Rain meant water. Rain meant life might continue. But this was not normal rain. The water that fell from the sky was black, tainted with soot, ash, radioactive particles, and countless other contaminants produced by the nuclear explosions and the fires that followed. The nuclear weapons hadn't just destroyed buildings and killed people. They had vaporized everything at ground zero, lifting millions of tons of irradiated debris into the atmosphere. This material had spread across the region, carried by the winds, forming clouds that now released their deadly cargo. The black rain fell for 4 days. It was relentless, a steady downpour that turned the ruins into a dark, sodden nightmare. Anywhere the rain touched became contaminated. Water sources were poisoned. The ground itself became radioactive. Plants that had somehow survived the initial devastation died as the contaminated water soaked into their roots. The black rain killed thousands of species. Animals that had survived the blasts succumbed to radiation poisoning. Birds fell from the sky. Fish died in the rivers and harbor. Insects, those hardy survivors, were decimated. The ecosystem that had supported life in Massachusetts for thousands of years was shattered in less than a week. For the human survivors, the black rain was a death sentence for many. Those who were caught in it, who had no shelter, or who didn't realize the danger, absorbed lethal doses of radiation. Their skin blistered and burned. Their hair fell out. They vomited blood. Radiation sickness claimed them within days or weeks, a slow and agonizing death. Those who understood the danger tried to find shelter, to wait out the rain. In basements, in subway tunnels, In any place that offered some protection from the falling water, people huddled and prayed for it to end. They boiled water before drinking it, trying to reduce the contamination. They covered themselves with whatever they could find to keep the rain off their skin. They survived day by day, hour by hour. The rain also revealed the scale of the destruction. As the black water washed through the ruins, it exposed the bodies. Thousands of corpses lay in the streets, on the elevated highways, in collapsed buildings. The rain stripped away the ash and debris that had covered them, creating a grotesque revelation of the human cost. In the glowing sea, the rain collected the intense radiation from ground zero and spread it across the wasteland. The crater itself became a pool of radioactive water, deadly to approach. The area that would become known as the crater of Atom glowed with an eerie yellow-green light, a permanent scar on the landscape. The environmental changes were rapid and permanent. The climate shifted as the debris and smoke from the nuclear explosions altered atmospheric conditions. The Commonwealth, which had experienced typical New England weather patterns of cold winters and warm summers, began to shift toward a more extreme climate. Temperature variations became more pronounced. Seasons became less predictable. The radiation storms that would plague the Commonwealth for centuries to come had their origin in these first terrible weeks. As weather patterns formed over the glowing sea, they picked up radioactive particles and spread them northeast toward Boston and beyond. These storms would become a regular occurrence, a deadly reminder of what had happened, forcing survivors to seek shelter whenever the familiar crackle of radiation filled the air. The waters around Boston Harbor became contaminated. The Charles River, once a recreational area, became a toxic flow. Marine life that had lived in these waters for millions of years began to change, mutate, or die. The few survivors faced an environment that was fundamentally hostile to their existence. Plant life began its transformation as well. Most vegetation simply died, unable to cope with the radiation levels. But some plants mutated, developing resistance to radiation. These would form the basis of the wasteland ecology that would eventually emerge. Mutated ferns, strange fungi that thrived in radioactive environments, twisted versions of common plants. The forest that would grow in the coming decades would be alien, hostile, nothing like what had existed before. In the immediate aftermath of the Great War, various military and government entities attempted to maintain some semblance of order and civilization. These efforts, while ultimately unsuccessful, represented humanity's desperate grasp for normalcy in the face of apocalypse. Military forces throughout the Commonwealth, those that had survived the initial blasts, attempted to follow their final orders. Emergency protocols called for the establishment of aid stations, the distribution of supplies, the maintenance of martial law. These soldiers, many of them suffering from radiation sickness themselves, tried to do their duty even as everything fell apart around them. The South Boston military checkpoint, which had been broadcasting emergency frequency RJ1138, became a focal point for military organization. Soldiers gathered there along with civilians seeking help. The checkpoint had supplies, medicine, clean water. For a brief time it seemed like a nucleus around which order might be restored. But the challenges were insurmountable. There was no clear chain of command. The electromagnetic pulses and the destruction of command centers meant that orders weren't getting through. Units were scattered, confused, unable to coordinate. Many personnel simply deserted, choosing to find their families or seek their own survival rather than follow orders that seemed increasingly meaningless. The supplies at the checkpoint ran out quickly. Too many people seeking help, not enough resources to provide it. The soldiers found themselves in the impossible position of deciding who would receive aid and who would be turned away. Arguments broke out, fights erupted. The checkpoint became another site of chaos rather than a beacon of order. At the Mass Bay Medical Center, the situation was even worse. The military had seized control, but they were overwhelmed by casualties. People with severe burns, radiation sickness, traumatic injuries from collapsed buildings, all flooded into the center. The medical staff, those who remained, did what they could, but medicine in limited supply, most equipment disabled by the electromagnetic pulses, and no way to sterilize instruments properly. The center became a place of suffering rather than healing. Triage decisions had to be made. Those likely to die were separated from those who might survive. But in an environment of such high radiation, even those designated as likely survivors often succumbed within days. The medical staff watched helplessly as people died from conditions that would have been treatable before the war. Disease began to spread through the survivors. Without proper sanitation, with water sources contaminated, with weakened immune systems from radiation exposure, illness swept through any gathering of people. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases killed people who had somehow survived the nuclear blasts. Infections from minor wounds became fatal without antibiotics. The social order that had existed before the war collapsed rapidly. In the face of starvation, radiation, and death on all sides, people made hard choices. Some banded together, forming small communities of mutual support. Others turned to violence, taking what they needed from those weaker than themselves. The line between survivor and raider was thin and easily crossed. Food became the most precious commodity. The supply chains that had fed Boston were destroyed. The farms that had provided produce were contaminated. The transportation network that had distributed goods no longer functioned. People ate what they could find, canned goods from ruined stores, food from collapsed homes, anything that might provide calories. But even finding food wasn't enough. The radiation contamination meant that much of what people consumed was itself radioactive. With each meal, survivors absorbed more radiation, accumulating doses that would eventually kill them or cause horrific mutations. Water was equally problematic. The black rain had contaminated most water sources. Boiling could kill bacteria, but it couldn't remove radioactive isotopes. People had to choose between dehydration and radiation poisoning. Many chose the latter, hoping they might survive long enough for help to arrive. But help wasn't coming. The federal government had effectively ceased to exist. The Enclave, that shadowy deep state organization, had retreated to its bunkers and oil rigs, abandoning the surface to its fate. The military chain of command had collapsed. Local governments were gone, their officials dead or missing. Mayor Hildenbrand's death in the Boston mayoral shelter became symbolic of the collapse of civic authority. The very people who were supposed to protect and lead the citizens had either died or abandoned them. There was no one in charge, no one coordinating relief efforts, no one planning for the future. Within weeks of the bombs falling, the attempts at maintaining order had largely ceased. The military personnel either died from radiation, deserted to find their families, or were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. The aid stations closed, the checkpoints were abandoned, the promise of food, shelter, and safety proved to be hollow. Humanity in the Commonwealth was on its own, scattered into small groups of survivors trying to make it through each day. The social structures that had organized and governed their lives for generations were gone, and nothing had yet emerged to replace them. The Commonwealth didn't become a wasteland in a day or even a month. The transformation from the gleaming city of 2077 to the radioactive ruins that would exist centuries later was a process that unfolded over years and decades, but the foundations of that transformation were laid in those first terrible months. The glowing sea became the defining feature of the new landscape. The massive crater at Ground Zero glowed with an eerie yellow-green light, visible from across the Commonwealth, especially at night. The intense radiation at the crater's center was lethal, capable of killing an unprotected person in minutes. But the radiation didn't stay contained. It spread outward, carried by wind and water, contaminating everything it touched. The area around the crater became a desert of scorched earth and radioactive ponds. Trees that hadn't been vaporized in the initial blast became charred skeletons, their twisted forms creating an alien landscape. The few structures that remained standing were half buried by landslides and sinkholes, gradually being swallowed by the earth itself. But even in this most hostile environment, life persisted. Radiation, while deadly to most forms of life, created opportunities for those that could adapt. Creatures began to emerge that could not only survive, but thrive in the irradiated wasteland. These were the first mutants, the ancestors of the monsters that would plague the Commonwealth for centuries. Rad scorpions, giant versions of common scorpions, appeared in the glowing sea. They burrowed through the contaminated earth, their bodies somehow able to process the radiation. They were aggressive, deadly, and perfectly adapted to the new environment. Deathclaws, though their presence in the glowing sea wouldn't become notable until later, were products of pre-war genetic engineering that had gone terribly wrong when their containment failed during the chaos. These creatures, part of military experiments, had been designed as weapons. Now, freed from human control and exposed to the mutations caused by radiation, they evolved into apex predators. Insects, always adaptable, mutated rapidly. Bloatflies grew to enormous sizes, bloodbugs, mutated mosquitoes, developed a taste for blood and the size to drain a person in minutes. Stingwings, mutated flies with venomous stingers, swarmed through the ruins. The insect populations, once held in check by the ecosystem, exploded in the absence of their natural predators. In Boston proper, the transformation was different but no less profound. The city had survived the direct impacts, but it was dying slowly. Without maintenance, the buildings began to deteriorate. Water infiltrated structures, rust spread through metal frameworks. The elevated highways, already damaged, continued to degrade. Sections collapsed over the years, creating new barriers and hazards through the urban landscape. The Charles River, no longer maintained by human intervention, began to reclaim land. Flooding became common. Streets that had been dry became canals. Buildings that had stood for generations found their foundations undermined by the changing water levels. The city was slowly sinking into the earth and water that surrounded it. The subway system, the T, flooded in many places. The tunnels became underground rivers, home to mutated creatures that found shelter in the darkness. In some places, the tunnels collapsed entirely, creating sinkholes in the streets above. In others, they remained passable, becoming highways for those who knew how to navigate them. Fenway Park, that grand old stadium where the swatting sultans had taken shelter, became a fortress of sorts. The survivors there, protected by the park's sturdy construction, managed to establish a small community. But their supplies ran out. Radiation took its toll. Eventually, only the strongest and most adapted survived to pass on their legacy to future generations. Throughout the Commonwealth, similar small groups of survivors tried to maintain pockets of civilization. Some succeeded for a time, creating communities that lasted months or even years. Others failed quickly, succumbing to disease, starvation, or violence. Each community told its own story of survival and loss. The Wu family in Natick Bank somehow survived unharmed in their house, a miracle of chance and location. The Tornquist family at West Everett Estates survived initially in a backyard bunker, managing to rebuild for a time before their luck ran out. The Miller family at Big John Salvage had a homemade bunker, but when the generator failed, they were trapped inside without proper ventilation, dying slowly of asphyxiation. These individual tragedies multiplied across the Commonwealth. Families that survived the initial blasts died in the weeks and months that followed. Bunkers became tombs, shelters became prisons. The hope that had sustained people through those first terrible days gradually faded as the reality of their situation became clear. This was permanent. There would be no rescue, no return to normal. The world they had known was gone forever. The ecology continued its radical transformation. The plants that survived developed resistance to radiation. Mutated variants of common crops appeared. Tato plants, a hybrid of tomato and potato, emerged as one of the few viable food sources. Mutated corn grew despite the contaminated soil. The survivors learned to eat these strange new foods, having no other choice. Brahmin appeared, two-headed mutant cattle that could survive on the sparse vegetation and contaminated water. Despite their grotesque appearance, they proved useful as pack animals and food sources for the human survivors. Other domestic animals mutated as well or simply died out, unable to adapt to the new environment. The human cost of the transformation was staggering. Of the hundreds of thousands of people who had lived in the Boston metropolitan area before the war, only a fraction remained alive within a year. Of those, many were slowly dying from radiation exposure. Some transformed into ghouls, their bodies ravaged by radiation but somehow still alive, their lifespans extended by the very thing that had destroyed them. These ghouls, called smoothskins by their non-mutated counterparts in cruel irony, would become a permanent fixture of the wasteland, living reminders of the Great War. Others were less fortunate, transforming into feral ghouls. These creatures had lost their minds to radiation, becoming little more than animals, attacking anything they encountered. They gathered in the ruins, particularly in places with high radiation, forming packs that would haunt the Commonwealth for centuries. In the darkest days after the Great War, as the Commonwealth transformed into a radioactive wasteland, seeds were being planted that would determine the region's future for the next 2 centuries. Deep beneath the ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, the group of faculty and students who had taken shelter during the bombing faced a choice. They could try to return to the surface, to take their chances in the wasteland that had once been Cambridge. Or they could go deeper, use their knowledge and skills to build something new, to survive and eventually thrive in a protected environment underground. They chose the latter. These survivors, many of them brilliant scientists and engineers, began the work of expanding the underground spaces beneath CIT. They had access to the university's experimental nuclear reactor, which had survived the war intact. This provided them with power, a precious resource in the devastated world above. Over the years, they dug deeper into the earth. They built sophisticated habitats in the bedrock beneath what had been their campus. They expanded the laboratories, creating research spaces that rivaled what they had possessed before the war. They salvaged equipment from the ruins above when it was safe to venture up. They adapted, improvised, and built. In 2110, 33 years after the bombs fell, the children and grandchildren of those original survivors formally founded the Institute. It was no longer just a survival shelter. It was a research facility, a community, a beacon of pre-war science preserved in the post-war world. They dedicated themselves to a singular mission, mankind redefined. The Institute represented one possible response to the apocalypse: retreat underground, isolate from the surface, and pursue technological advancement without the moral and social constraints that had limited pre-war science. They would become brilliant, powerful, and increasingly detached from the surface dwellers whom they viewed as primitives. But the Institute was not the only seed planted in those early post-war years. Throughout the Commonwealth, other groups were forming, other communities were taking shape. Some survivors banded together for mutual protection, forming the first raider gangs. These groups, born from desperation and survival instinct, would evolve into the violent factions that would plague the Commonwealth for generations. Not all raiders were evil by choice. Many simply made hard decisions in impossible circumstances. But over time, as the culture of violence became established, the distinction between survivor and predator blurred. Others maintained a different vision. The idea that humanity could rebuild, could create something better from the ashes of the old world, persisted among some survivors. These people would eventually become the foundation for organizations like the Minutemen, though that organization itself wouldn't form until much later. They believed in community, in mutual defense, in the possibility of reclaiming the wasteland. In the ruins of Fenway Park, a community slowly formed. The stadium's thick walls had protected the initial survivors, and its size allowed for the development of a real settlement. Over the decades, this would evolve into Diamond City, one of the most successful settlements in the Commonwealth. But in those early years, it was just a group of desperate people trying to make do with what they had. The Children of Atom, a religious movement that would come to worship radiation as a divine force, had its roots in these early post-war years. Those who had survived high doses of radiation, who had seen the terrible power unleashed on October 23rd, began to develop a theology around that experience. To them, the bombs were not a tragedy, but a revelation. Atom had spoken, had shown them the path to division and infinite worlds. The faith would grow slowly at first, but it would persist, finding followers among ghouls and smoothskins alike. The environmental changes continued to shape what would become of the Commonwealth. The glowing sea remained the most visible scar, but its influence extended far beyond its borders. The radiation storms that blew northeast from the glowing sea became a regular occurrence. When dark clouds gathered and the air began to crackle with radioactive energy, people learned to seek shelter immediately. These storms spread contamination, caused mutations, and made travel across the Commonwealth dangerous. The rising sea levels and changing water tables transformed the landscape. East Boston, much of which had been built on landfill, experienced extensive liquefaction during the earthquakes that followed the nuclear blasts. Structures sank, the neighborhood flooded. Over time, it became a wetland, largely abandoned except for scavengers and the occasional settlement. The Saugus River and other waterways became more contaminated over time, not less. Pre-war industrial sites, their containment measures destroyed in the war, leaked chemicals and radioactive materials into the water system. Decades of this contamination created areas that would remain toxic for centuries. Lake Quannapowitt, already contaminated before the war by mass fusions dumping, became one of the most radioactive bodies of water in the Commonwealth. The lake bed was strewn with detritus and safety barrels that had ruptured in the war. Despite the obvious dangers, the area around the lake would eventually support settlements, showing the desperate determination of humanity to survive even in hostile conditions. The mutations in wildlife continued to produce new and dangerous creatures. Super mutants would appear later, products of experimentation with the forced evolutionary virus. But even without that artificial catalyst, natural mutation was creating monsters. The radstags, mutated deer with two heads, became common in the more forested areas. Mongrels, mutated dogs, formed packs that hunted anything they could bring down. Mole rats grew to enormous sizes and developed resistance to radiation. As the years passed and became decades, a new generation grew up in the wasteland. These children had never known the world before the bombs. To them, the ruins were just the way things were. The radiation storms were a fact of life, no more remarkable than rain had been to their grandparents. The mutant creatures were wildlife, to be hunted or avoided depending on the situation. This post-war generation would be the ones to truly build the Commonwealth as it would exist for the next 2 centuries. They didn't have the memory of what had been lost. They only had the present and the future they would create. By the year 2287, more than 200 years after the bombs fell, the Commonwealth had developed into something unique. It was not quite the hellscape that other regions had become, but neither was it a place of hope and progress. It existed in a strange liminal state, suspended between survival and collapse. Boston's skyline was still recognizable, though changed. The mass fusion building still stood, the tallest structure in the ruins, its logo still visible from miles away. But it was scarred, damaged, occupied by gunners, a mercenary faction that had claimed it as a stronghold. The elevated highways still cut through the financial district, though many sections had collapsed, creating barriers and hazards for anyone trying to navigate the city. The streets of downtown Boston were battlegrounds. Various raider groups, triggerman gangs, super mutants, and gunners fought constantly for control of strategic locations. The sound of gunfire echoed through the ruins. Explosions were common. For wastelanders, moving through downtown Boston was incredibly dangerous. The safest route was often vertical, using the elevated structures to bypass the chaos in the streets below. Diamond City, built in and around Fenway Park, had become the largest and most successful settlement in the Commonwealth. The old stadium walls protected thousands of residents. A functioning economy had developed. Caravans brought goods from across the region. Diamond City represented the pinnacle of post-war civilization in the Commonwealth, though it was still a shadow of what Boston had been before the war. Good Neighbor, a settlement built in downtown Boston, represented a different approach to wasteland survival. It was a haven for ghouls, drifters, and anyone who didn't fit in elsewhere. Run by a ghoul named Hancock, who styled himself a mayor, Good Neighbor embraced the chaos of the wasteland while maintaining enough order to function as a community. The Institute had become a legend, a boogeyman that parents used to frighten children. Stories circulated of people being replaced by synths, synthetic humans indistinguishable from the real thing. Settlements would disappear, their inhabitants taken by the Institute for unknown purposes. The Institute denied involvement in surface affairs, but their synths were seen throughout the Commonwealth, carrying out missions that the surface dwellers could only guess at. The Brotherhood of Steel, a military organization dedicated to preserving and controlling advanced technology, had established a major presence in the Commonwealth. They arrived in force, bringing the massive airship Prydwen and establishing a base at Boston Airport. Their mission: destroy the Institute and secure its technology. Their arrival would spark the war for the Commonwealth, a conflict that would determine the future of the entire region. The Minutemen, an organization dedicated to protecting settlements and ordinary people, had fallen on hard times. Once a powerful force for good in the Commonwealth, they had been nearly destroyed by internal conflicts and external attacks. By 2287, they existed more as an idea than an organization, waiting for someone to revive them. The Railroad, a secretive organization dedicated to freeing synths from the Institute, operated from the shadows. They had suffered devastating losses when the Institute discovered their previous headquarters, but they persisted, conducting a shadow war against the most powerful faction in the Commonwealth. The glowing sea remained as deadly as ever. The crater at its heart still glowed with radioactive light. The Children of Atom had established their settlement, the Crater of Atom, at Ground Zero, worshipping in what they considered holy ground. The radiation there was still intense enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes, yet the Children of Atom seemed immune, their faith somehow protecting them, or perhaps just their unique biology as products of generations of radiation exposure. Radiation storms still blew in from the glowing sea, forcing people to seek shelter whenever the air began to crackle with radioactive energy. These storms were a constant reminder of what had happened, carrying the legacy of October 23, 2077, across the Commonwealth with each occurrence. The CIT ruins, what remained of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, was a dangerous place. Super mutants controlled much of the area, fighting with Institute synths that emerged from the underground facilities. The crater in Cambridge remained, a radioactive scar in the middle of what had once been a center of learning. Throughout the Commonwealth, settlements struggled to survive. Farms eked out harvests from contaminated soil. Water purifiers worked constantly to make the irradiated water drinkable. Scavengers picked through the ruins, searching for pre-war technology and supplies. Traders ran caravans between settlements, bringing news and goods along dangerous routes. The Commonwealth was a place of contradictions. In some areas, life had achieved a kind of normalcy. People farmed, raised children, built homes, and tried to create lives worth living. In other areas, constant warfare and radiation made survival a daily struggle. The region existed on a knife's edge, balanced between recovery and collapse. And yet, 2 centuries after the worst day in human history, people endured. They adapted. They built communities. They fell in love, had children, created art, told stories. Humanity persisted, as it always had, finding ways to survive, even in the most hostile circumstances. The Commonwealth that existed in 2287 was the direct descendant of that terrible day in 2077. Every settlement, every faction, every mutant creature, every radioactive storm, all of it traced back to those 2 hours when the nuclear fire consumed the old world. The Great War had ended long ago, but its consequences rippled through every aspect of life in the wasteland. Standing in the Commonwealth in 2287, a traveller might look up at the stars and try to imagine what this place had been. The ruins offered clues. The Freedom Trail still wound through Boston, its red brick line faded but still visible, still connecting historical sites that had somehow survived. The Massachusetts State House still stood, its dome tarnished but intact. The Old North Church pointed toward the sky, a testament to architecture that had been built to last. But these were just remnants, shadows of a world that was gone. The Boston of 2077 had been a living city, full of people with hopes and dreams, routines and relationships. It had been a place where history and future collided, where you could walk colonial streets in the morning and work in a nuclear-powered office tower in the afternoon. Now it was a graveyard, haunted by ghosts both literal and metaphorical. The feral ghouls that stalked the ruins had once been people, Bostonians who had lived through those first terrible days only to lose their minds to radiation over the following years. They were reminders of what had been lost, twisted versions of humanity that attacked anything living that came near. The survivors, those who maintained their humanity despite everything, carried the weight of that history. Many knew the stories passed down through generations. They knew about the Great War, about the bombs, about the world that had existed before. But it was an abstract knowledge like knowing about ancient Rome or Egypt. The past was history, something to be learned but not truly understood. What would those people of 2077 think if they could see what their world had become? Would they be proud of humanity's persistence? Would they be horrified at the violence and suffering that had become normal? Would they recognize their city in the ruins that remained? Perhaps they would focus on the small victories, the settlements that had been built, the children playing in Diamond City, the caravans bringing trade between communities, the moments of beauty that existed even in the wasteland, like sunrise over the ruined skyline, or the strange flowers that bloomed in the radioactive soil. Or perhaps they would see only the loss. The millions who had died, the knowledge that had been forgotten, the technology that could no longer be produced or maintained, the society that had taken centuries to build, destroyed in 2 hours and replaced with something primitive, violent, and desperate. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. The Commonwealth was both better and worse than anyone from 2077 might imagine. It was a place of suffering, yes, but also of resilience. A place where darkness reigned, but also where light persisted. A place where humanity had been broken, but not destroyed. The transformation of Boston from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to simply the Commonwealth was complete. The state, the government, the society, all the structures that had defined the region were gone. What remained was something new, something that the people of 2077 would barely recognize, but that was, in its own way, remarkably human. Because humans adapt, they survive, they find ways to continue even when logic says they should give up. They build new societies from the wreckage of the old. They tell stories, preserve knowledge, pass traditions to their children. They fight, yes, but they also love. They destroy, but they also create. The Great War had killed billions. It had destroyed civilization. It had poisoned the earth and sky. It had created monsters and unleashed horrors that would persist for centuries, but it had not ultimately defeated humanity. 210 years later, people still lived in the Commonwealth. They still hoped. They still dreamed of something better. The sole survivor of Vault 111 emerging into the wasteland in 2287 would have the unique perspective of having lived in both worlds. They would remember Boston as it had been on that October morning. They would remember the sirens, the panic, the flash of light on the horizon. And they would see what it had become, would walk the streets they had known, now transformed beyond recognition. That perspective, that living bridge between past and present, would play a crucial role in determining the Commonwealth's future. But that's another story, one that would unfold in the days and years after the sole survivor's awakening. For now, as we conclude our journey through that terrible day and its aftermath, let us remember what was lost and what persisted. Let us honor the millions who died on October 23rd, 2077, and in the dark years that followed. Let us acknowledge the suffering and the sacrifice, and let us recognize the remarkable resilience of humanity which survived the unsurvivable and built something new from the ashes of the old world. The day the Commonwealth fell silent was the day the bombs fell, but it was also the day that set in motion everything that would follow. It was an ending and a beginning, a tragedy and the seed of transformation. It was perhaps the most significant single day in the history of the Fallout universe, and its echoes continue to reverberate through every irradiated stone, every rusted car, every mutated creature, and every wasteland survivor who looks up at the night sky and wonders what the world might have been if those missiles had never launched, if the war had never come, if October 23rd, 2077 had been just another autumn Saturday in Boston. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the Great War and its impact on Boston. This is the kind of deep lore dive that makes the Fallout universe so compelling. The world building, the attention to detail, the tragedy and hope intertwined. All of it creates a setting that resonates with us as players and as human beings. If you enjoyed this journey through the Commonwealth's darkest day, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more lore to explore in the Fallout universe, and I'm excited to bring you more of these deep dives in the future. Until next time, Wanderer, stay safe out there in the wasteland, and remember, war never changes. But humanity does, and that makes all the difference. Sleep well, and dream of better tomorrows.